I grew up just as the internet was emerging from the niche spaces of university mainframes and was entering the slightly less niche space of nerd living rooms and community libraries. The internet at this time was almost devoid of corporate influence, or at the very least was devoid of any singular corporate influence. Google wasn't a thing yet, and there were a myriad of search engines, chat rooms, social spaces, and technologies that were all competing with one another in a space that the majority of the people I grew up around neither understood nor cared about. What separates this version of the internet from the one that exists today, apart from the technology that underpinned it, was the sense that if you were there, you were part of an exclusive club. There is a magic and mystery to this period of online communication that is kind of hard to convey. Individuals and small, close-knit communities took center stage. It was a place where misfits, artists, nerds, and genuinely weird people existed together. There were assumptions you could make about the people who were online at the time. They almost certainly were dweebs of one form or another. Getting online, while easier than it was in the 80s, was still something that required the kind of rarefied technical skill set that almost guaranteed you'd have something in common with the random strangers you'd run into. The Venn diagram of people who were online and loved video games and anime and technology and obscure media was almost a perfect circle. It was a place of ready-made friends at a time when those interests and hobbies were not only obscure, but looked down upon. The internet was small. It was a place where seeing someone with the same username across multiple websites was actually a pretty good indication that they were, in fact, the same person. It was a place where even popular social media sites, though they didn't really resemble social media as we know it today, had a user count that numbered in the thousands, maybe 10,000. Most of these communities were even smaller than that. A message board with a few hundred people, a text-based multi-user dungeon with a few dozen. The difference here manifested in one key way. You got to know people as individuals. You weren't shouting into the void of an algorithmically generated newsfeed, hoping that somewhere your message was being received. You weren't competing for mindshare with bots, corporately sponsored influencers, and large conglomerates. You were just talking to other people, expressing yourself through chat rooms, profile pages, maybe the occasional website or two built as your own personal homepage. There was also a distinct lack of money involved. No one had really figured out how to monetize this communications technology in a way that was particularly effective, and so people who created on the internet created simply for creation's sake, or to communicate, or to express themselves, or to find community. Videoverse is a 2023 visual novel created by Lucy Blundell, and it is a visual novel about this version of the internet, or more accurately, the version of the internet that was beginning to give way to the more corporate, monetized, and modern version of the internet that we know today. It's a game about community, about the relationships that were built on the old World Wide Web. It's about the strength of the connections forged across countries and continents at a time when maintaining those very real, very powerful relationships involved delicately dancing around the limitations of barely functional and wholly inadequate tech. It's a game about how much those communities mattered to those connected to them, about how they acted as anchors for people whose real-life experiences and real-world communities failed to provide them the connection and support they needed. And ultimately, it's a tragedy about what happens when those communities begin to fall apart, or are torn apart. Videoverse depicts an almost alternate reality version of the internet circa the early 2000s. The titular social network is a feature of the Kinmoku Shark, a video game console owned by 15-year-old Emmett, the game's main character. And just out of the gate, I love this thing. It's a surreal combination of laptop and portable gaming device that resembles a giant fluffy novelty Nintendo DS. Its aesthetic screams early 2000s tech. It's thick and round and friendly looking. Its external controller looks like the kind of cheap third-party controller you'd force your friends to use when they came over to play video games. The webcam that's precariously purchased on the top of the device has the all-seeing eye look that so many webcams of the era had. It's a device that you look at and just know you'll barely be able to recognize the image it's capturing. It's a mixture of the Game Boy camera and a cheap Logitech webcam. The ones you'd find with that translucent blue plastic that Apple made so trendy when it first introduced the iMac. Videoverse itself is the platonic ideal of early 2000s social networks. It's a mix of Miiverse, message boards, IRC, DeviantArt, and the most rudimentary beginnings of video chat. The kind of video chat that, despite its painfully low resolution, was so bleeding edge it served as a dividing line between people whose parents could afford high-speed internet and those of us who were still struggling with dial-up. Those of us whose attempts to log on to our communities were preceded by a minutes-long ritual of telephone tones and the grinding screech of 56K modems. Seeing a friend online, like actually seeing them, was an event. When a person you may have spent months speaking to solely via text suddenly materialized in front of you as a living, breathing individual, it felt like magic. Or witchcraft. Bizarrely intimate and uncanny, and often a little disturbing. The image you had of them in your head suddenly had to rapidly reconcile with the image of what you saw on screen. Sometimes it felt euphoric and exciting. Other times it felt like the person you knew just evaporated. Your own mental construction of the character they played online having to give way to this strange entity you didn't recognize but insisted was the person you thought you knew so well. Every online interaction at this time had a touch of the uncanny valley, and despite the inherent oddness of the internet at the time, many of us were more than happy to call this place home. Videoverse excels at capturing the comfy, tight-knit liminal space that was this era of the internet. The network defaults to a minimalist, monochrome interface with an option to unlock duochrome themes as you progress the game's story. Images are sparse outside of the landing page, and what is there is this kind of abstract iconography you'd associate with ancient bulletin board systems. The small, unobtrusive in-universe ads that are sprinkled throughout are pitch-perfect recreations of this era's plucky attempts at marketing. There's a perfectly captured, overly excitable, amateurish quality to the interface that was the internet aesthetic of the early aughts. No one knew what they were doing, and no one really cared. The visuals of Videoverse are simply delightful, and when you're playing, it's hard to remember that you haven't actually traveled back in time. Everything here feels authentic, while still maintaining a cohesive and unique look all its own. But where Videoverse really shines is in its writing. Kinmoku nails everything about how it felt to chat on these systems, how people express themselves, the slang, the slight variances in writing style that helped you differentiate between people. The way all of this is utilized to build character and drama is so fundamentally real that I could feel my own memories of old, long-forgotten friends beginning to bubble to the surface. The pauses during uncomfortable conversations have a dramatic weight to them, as do the moments when characters abruptly log off, leaving you to wonder, did I say something wrong? The main characters are wonderfully realized, but it's also the smaller side characters whose stories play out over Videoverse's message boards that really add emotional texture to the game. Many of these characters you may not ever talk to directly, many you only speak with briefly, but all of them grow and change and live their lives in parallel to the main story in a way that's hard to ignore. Characters gradually find safety and community in Videoverse. Some struggle with depression, with coming out, with their own relationships. Some are just kind of assholes, leaving it up to the player to report trollish comments to the mods in a really cute side quest that involves keeping the community as positive and welcoming as possible. Videoverse is more than a home to its inhabitants. It's a shelter. And when the existence of Videoverse is threatened with an imminent shutdown, you feel the despair rippling through the community as every relationship, every connection, every shared joy and sorrow risks being torn from the people who rely on it. The most prominent of these relationships is the one between Emmett and Vivi. You first meet Vivi the way most online friendships start. Incidentally, it begins with a chance encounter with a piece of their fan art on the feudal fantasy community. An artist himself, Emmett instantly connects with one of their pieces. Vivi is entirely anonymous at this point, not even bothering to use anything beyond the service's default avatar. Their art, however, stands apart, and that, combined with the mutual love the two characters have for the fictional feudal fantasy, kickstarts their interest in one another. The first real interaction happens after Vivi receives a particularly nasty comment on one of their posts. Feeling instantly protective of this shy new user, Emmett quickly reports the comment to the moderators and realizes that they've drawn the attention of other users, including Emmett's friend Zalor. The two chat over the shared mystery of this new user, with Zalor quickly honing in on the idea that Vivi might actually be a girl. This exchange is really cute and subtly captures how male-dominated early online communities were. Women? On the internet? What a concept. Zalor's fixation on Vivi's gender is odd, but it never comes across as gross or creepy. Zalor is childish, and clearly hormonal, but he's insightful, and has managed to clock something that Emmett's missed. Vivi's drawings seem to communicate a fascination with the game's exceedingly bishi protagonist, Hanzo. The other users begin to see the pattern as well, and Vivi's art increasingly becomes the target of trolling. Emmett's interest in this new user remains delightfully innocent. He's just excited to chat with a fellow fan and to possibly exchange some art tips. I love how Vivi is introduced here. The pacing of their initial interactions, the gentle, almost timid first few conversations, the casual mystery that accompanied every new acquaintance back then, it's so real, in fact, that it brought up memories of someone I knew long, long ago. I met Lilu on an online forum, much like Videoverse, and our initial interactions were mirrors of Vivi and Emmett's. We were writers, rather than artists, and huge fans of an incredibly cheesy but also incredibly addictive television show. It was bonkers, but the two of us loved it. Lilu and I's initial conversations happened in public, occasionally quoting each other in threads about what crazy twist the latest episode had delivered. Eventually, we began recognizing each other's screen names and the little details about our real lives that we let slip into conversations. She knew I was Canadian, I knew she was from Chicago, and after a month or so, we started to recognize something else. Both of us were from very abusive homes. It started small. She would comment about getting into a fight with her mom, or her anxiety, or the way she would bury herself in books, something we both would do as a way of escaping our everyday realities. And as the weeks dragged on, I would notice little slips in her mood. One particularly frustrated post prompted me to send her a private message asking if she was okay. She wasn't, and neither was I. And through our own shared trauma and coping mechanisms, we began to develop a friendship that moved beyond message boards and into instant messengers, and then finally to phone calls, made possible with prepaid phone cards and a lot of anxiety about having to explain who exactly I was spending so much time talking with on the phone. I distinctly remember the first time I heard her voice. It was small and unsure. Her first hello came out as a question, even though she was the one that had called me. The first few moments of the call consisted of awkward comments about how awkward it was to be talking to each other, which eventually gave way to in-jokes, laughter, and a realization that we weren't meeting for the first time. We'd been friends for months. I also remember her mother and brother fighting in the background, and her embarrassment at having to cover the mouthpiece of the cordless while she bounded upstairs to a room where the shouts wouldn't so easily pierce the walls. She'd apologized profusely, claiming that they always had a habit of fighting whenever she was on the phone. I told her that I'd understood. My own family did the same thing, waiting to shatter the peace of a quiet phone call with a sudden discovery that the dishes hadn't been done yet, or the shoes were on the floor, or the lawn wasn't mowed. What would follow was a tirade of yelling, designed and perfectly timed to embarrass. I had long since recognized the pattern. It was never about chores. It was about dominance, and letting you and anyone you might be talking to know that they were in charge, that they had the power, and that there was no escaping them. But escape them we did. As the months dragged on, Lilu and I became shields for each other. And while we still talked about the television we watched and the books we loved and the games we played, we spent more time sharing personal stories. Hopes, dreams, fears. It was another few months before I saw what she looked like for the first time. Cameras still had film back then, and both of us had to take physical photos and go through the tedious process of scanning them before being able to send them over MSN Messenger. I told her I thought her red hair was beautiful. She told me she didn't actually have red hair and that her scanner had done something weird to the colors in the photo. She told me I looked sad in mine. I laughed and told her that I was smiling. Yeah, I remember her writing back. You still look sad, though. There's a creeping dread surrounding Vivi and Emmett's relationship early on, one that reminded me so much of the friendship I developed with Lilu. Something is clearly going on in the background of Vivi's life, and as Emmett tries to get the young girl to open up to him, she is a girl after all, she begins pulling away. Disconnecting from Emmett is easy. This is an online relationship after all, and Videoverse obfuscates their identities behind technology, anonymity, and a casualness that the early internet brought to connections. It was profoundly easy to form connections back then, and even easier to break them. As Lilu herself once said to me, "I don't know why you care about me so much. I'm not even real." But Emmett does care about Vivi, and as his feelings for her shift from friendship to the early blossoming of something more, she begins to retreat from the relationship, using the technology between them as a shield. She logs off abruptly when conversations get too intense and seemingly disappears for long periods of time. This causes Emmett's own sense of panic around the relationship to rise. Instead of putting distance between the two of them, her aloofness prompts him to cling to her even more, all while feeling like he's walking a tightrope in their relationship. Any wrong message, any ill-considered text, might send their friendship plummeting off the side. Videoverse delivers this tension with an understanding not only of what communication back then looked like, but what it felt like. The asynchronous nature of their interactions has weight. Every delay between responses, every shift in tone, every anxious reassessment of each conversation perfectly captures how much ambiguity there was in online relationships back then, and how scary it was when the status of those relationships wasn't clear. Emmett and everyone on Videoverse has another problem. The platform has been experiencing technical hiccup after technical hiccup, and it's soon clear why. Kinmoku is paving the way for a new social network, one that will be at the core of their new console, the Dolphin. Videoverse is slowly going to be shut down, severing each and every relationship forged on the service. And in an optional scene in the latter part of the game, you discover that Kinmoku also plans on leveraging modern data harvesting techniques to start selling each user's personal information. The Videoverse community being forcibly dragged into a brave new frontier, the gentle innocence and playfulness of the old service being demolished to make way for something colder and more corporate. All of this is happening while Vivi has seemingly disappeared. And with the shutdown of Videoverse finally being given a hard date, the community scrambles to say goodbye, desperately trying to preserve the relationships they've made. The one Emmett truly cares about, though, is nowhere to be found. And realizing that he has no other way of contacting Vivi, his fear of losing her completely is slowly concretizing into reality, him obsessively watching her last login date on her profile, hoping for some sign that she's been active in the community. And then it happens. She logs back on. And after a happy reunion between the two, we finally learn what has been hovering over their relationship this whole time. Prior to meeting Emmett, Vivi had been in an accident, leaving her reliant on a wheelchair. The prognosis is up in the air, and she fears never being able to walk again. The uncertainty, depression, and isolation that followed was one of the catalyzing events that led her to joining Videoverse in the first place. The joy of rekindling their friendship doesn't last long. As the shutdown date of Videoverse approaches, they realize they have no way of staying in contact with one another. No material connection outside of the confines of the online world they inhabit. One that is now at the mercy of changing business priorities and a shifting technological landscape. Their one hope is in finding each other again on this new service, and it's this hope they cling to. They promise to meet again once the Dolphin releases and attempt to exchange IDs so they can find each other after the dust settles. But it's too late. A network interruption punctuates their final conversation, and it feels as if their entire world is collapsing around them. And before they're able to exchange email addresses in a final desperate attempt to keep their friendship alive, the service shuts down for good. The final moments Vivi and Emmett have together on Videoverse ends in a way that is almost deliriously cruel. Through the course of the game, you've rooted for these characters and all the other users you've met along the way, hoping that in the end they would find their way back to each other. And they do, but only for the briefest of moments. There's no stopping the plans that have been set in motion, and the ones pulling the strings have little care for the residents of the community they've built or the relationships that they've formed. This is an easy story to relate to for anyone who spent a lot of time online. One of the first internet communities I remember joining, back when my age was still in the single digits, was a place called Arcadium Refugees. It was a proto-Facebook, and the Refugees subtitle was a result of it itself being a scrapped-together community after its predecessor, Arcadium, was taken offline by its parent company, Envolve. Many of the people there remembered the old gaming community that they had fled from, but many lost friendships in the migration. Many others were brand new, myself included, having only briefly discovered the original Arcadium a few months prior to its shutting down. Arcadium Refugees, often referred to by its users as refs, also became a shelter for other online communities whose parent corporations found themselves reeling from the .com bust. I remember logging in one day and seeing a message to users of Firefly, a music discovery community that had eventually been purchased and shuttered by Microsoft. It offered condolences for the loss of their home, friends, and welcoming them to a new group of chronically online nerds. This happened repeatedly, until Refs itself was taken down by its original creator after finally tiring of having to police an ever-expanding community that was starting to be filled with the kinds of unsavory characters that you really don't want to be responsible for. Videoverse itself also suffers from this problem, which you learn if you complete one of its many side quests. And then there was Lilu. Vivi and Emmett's relationship brought back memories of my old friend, but our talks ended in ways that weren't nearly as dramatic. Despite us being close, life, misunderstandings, and growing up simply got in the way, and we began to speak less and less. Our own relationships in real life, as if we weren't part of each other's real lives, took center stage. Eventually, we lost track of usernames and email addresses, social media tools came and went, and at some point, every avenue that we could have used to reconnect was closed to us. We're both savvy enough that were we to follow the few remaining breadcrumbs of each other that we still had, we could probably reconnect. But decades have passed, and that relationship has run its course for both of us. Still, I find myself thinking about her from time to time, still trying to fully understand what it was that we had. We tripped over each other during some of the worst years of either of our lives, and in the moments of vulnerability we often shared, we would confide that one was often the only thing the other had tethering them to hope, to some sort of future we could get to if we only just held on a little longer. I know enough to know that we both ended up in that future. And that knowledge is good enough. It's a good ending. And sometimes a good ending is all you can ask for. Videoverse isn't just a great visual novel. It's a monument to every close friend and familiar stranger we encountered during that Wild West period of the internet. That time when the tension between community and commerce was more balanced. A time when the real world, whatever that was, attempted to diminish the connections we made there. But those relationships were real, still are, even if they reside firmly in the past. So, to all the people I met on Arcadium Refugees, on Talk City, on the Mystic Shadows Inn, on A5, thank you. To Melissa, I'm sorry for thinking you were a girl for a year and not realizing that Millis was your last name. To Rebel Cool, thanks for introducing an obnoxious 9-year-old to my first few HTML tags and helping set in motion my love of technology and creating things on the internet. To Strider, thanks for all that high-level gear you let me keep after stealing it before the guy who actually PK'd you could pick it up. God damn, he was mad that he couldn't attack me because of that level restriction. To Pachuca, I don't know how you managed to consistently hack that game we both played together, but the chaos you caused by dropping exploding pizzas into the world will be something I'll never forget. To Polymer, thanks for convincing me to let you read that story I was writing but was too embarrassed to show anyone. And thanks again for going so far as to draw the 3 main characters as a way of encouraging me. I still have the image. And to Lilu, I don't think I would have made it through my teenage years without you. You gave me warmth and kindness at a time when it was almost completely lacking in my life. Thank you for holding my hand and letting me hold yours as we navigated the chaos of growing up. Thank you for calling me and letting me listen to your voice as I fell asleep when things got really bad. We navigated the labyrinth of our lives together, pulled each other up as the staircases got steeper, rested against each other when we needed a moment to catch our breath. We got separated at some point, but we were close enough to the top that we were able to make it on our own. I can't see you from where I'm standing, but I know we're both able to finally start enjoying the view. And software glitch or not, you looked incredible with red hair.